There is something peculiar about towns that refuse to mourn in the cold breath of northern Vermont. Beneath pine shadows and frost-kissed gravestones, there once stood a town that behaved like death had never touched it. Children played in silence where tombstones used to stand. A garden bloomed where grief was meant to grow. And if you dared to ask about the dead, they would only blink, confused, as if the very word held no meaning. But death had visited this town, again and again. It was not war. It was not plague. It was not a curse. It was a doctor, a man trained in the healing of minds who came to erase pain, but stayed to erase people. His name was Dr. Alphonse Mercer, and what he practiced was not medicine. It was a quiet, creeping experiment in memory, in silence, in control. Through the careful erosion of memory, he replaced sorrow with suggestion. He called it therapeutic recalibration. But the townsfolk gave it another name. They whispered it when the wind was cruel. Mercer's fog. This is not a story about death. It is about what happens when a town forgets it ever loved at all. Now, step back with me into 1894, and listen to the town that lost its dead. The year was 1894. Vermont's air still bit like it always did, crisp, unkind, and dry enough to peel the skin from lips. The town of Graymer was small, forgettable, nestled between wooded hills that hid it like a secret. They had a graveyard, once, an old one. Stones tilting like crooked teeth, moss-stripped, some unreadable. Children dared each other to run between them at dusk. The preacher's dog used to howl at a particular grave every Sunday after sunset. Death was part of Graymore. It sat beside them at dinner tables and watched through windows. But something changed that spring. It began with the smell of lavender. The graveyard, without warning or permission, had been transformed. No funeral marked the shift. No shovel clanged. No stone was lifted in public view. One morning, it was simply gone. In its place bloomed purple fields of lavender and sage, rich, fragrant, unnerving in their perfection. No one claimed to have planted them. No one remembered removing the graves. And when asked about the bodies, the town gave blank stares or polite smiles, as if the question itself was absurd. Mrs. Hargrove, who once visited her husband's grave every Sunday, now served tea in her parlor, with 2 chairs, never 3. When asked about her late husband, she said, "My husband is in Boston for business. Always has been." But her husband had died 4 years prior. The church had buried him. The town had mourned. His name was once etched clearly in the stone that marked the center of the graveyard. Now, not only was the stone gone, but the memory had been plucked clean. All but one man noticed the change. Simon Bell, the town's clockmaker, and by all accounts, its only skeptic. He remembered the graves. He remembered the funerals. He remembered death. But when he spoke of it, people grew uneasy. The librarian, once his close friend, said, "Simon, perhaps you have confused yourself. No one has died here. Not in my lifetime." The blacksmith's son, once lost to scarlet fever, was now spoken of as if he had simply never existed. The town did not grieve. The town did not remember. The town did not want to dot. Simon began to suspect that something far darker had bloomed with those flowers. Entered Dr. Mercer. He arrived months before the garden appeared, a quiet man with thin spectacles, a trimmed beard, and a voice like warm milk. He did not advertise his profession. Instead, he rented a room above the old tailor's shop and offered free consultations for nervous ailments and melancholia. What he practiced, however, was far beyond nerves. People said his sessions helped, that after an hour with Mercer, they felt lighter, clearer, as though a weight had been lifted. Widows who had worn black for years now wore pastels and smiled in the streets. But Simon noticed something deeper, something unsettling. After seeing Mercer, people not only stopped mourning, they stopped remembering. The woman who had lost both sons in a barn fire now claimed she had never borne children. The mayor, whose wife had passed from consumption, now spoke of himself as a lifelong bachelor. Mercer's patients grew in number, and their memories vanished, like frost beneath the morning sun. The flower garden, a place of silence, Simon visited. The new garden one morning in late May. The lavender shimmered under the weak sun. No birds sang. No insects hummed. It was too quiet. He knelt near where his aunt's grave used to be. He knew the spot, had sat there with her Bible and a candle every year since her passing. Now, the ground felt too soft. Digging with bare hands, he struck something hard. Not bone, not coffin, wood fresh painted, clean. He uncovered a plank. perfectly preserved, as if recently placed. It read, "Memory is a burden." Simon's breath caught in his throat. Someone had not only removed the graves, they had rewritten the earth. The town hall incident that evening, Simon stood before the town council. He spoke with clarity, urgency, and trembled as he laid the wooden sign before them, but their faces were unreadable, calm, serene. "One councilman, a man whose mother had died only the year before," said Simon. "Perhaps you need rest." No such graveyard existed. "Our town has always had gardens." Another added, "You spend too much time alone. You fix clocks, but time can be a cruel trickster. Perhaps it has fooled you." Simon left in silence. That night, he found something more disturbing. His own family portrait, the one with his father, mother, and younger sister, all long past, was missing from the hallway. In its place was a blank frame, and behind it, a faint scent of lavender. Mercer's fog begins to thicken the next morning. Simon visited the church. Its records had once been thick with births, deaths, and marriages. The ledger was gone. The pastor claimed he had never kept such records. Simon remembered Reverend Gray, remembered burying him, but the man standing at the pulpit now wore his face just younger. Just too perfect. "Reverend Gray?" Simon asked. The man smiled. "I have always been Reverend Gray." But Simon knew, the original Gray had walked with a limp. This one did not. In the town of Graymore, death had not left. It had only been erased, and in its place bloomed something colder, crueler, and far more permanent. The question no longer was who had died. The question was now, what else have we forgotten, and who made us forget? The first thing to vanish was the name Morning Hill. For nearly a century, the townsfolk of Elmbrook had buried their dead on that sloped patch of land overlooking the river. Headstones marked with family names: Alder, Whitcomb, Glass, Harrow, all aligned in reverent silence. Even the children knew the hill by name. They would pass it with bowed heads or whispers, believing they disturbed the rest of those beneath the soil. But by the spring of 1894, the name began slipping from lips like dust off old pages. It started. Subtly, a child asked her father what that hill was called, and he furrowed his brow, unable to recall. A widow on her morning walk paused by the gate and turned away in confusion, as if unsure why she had ever come that way before. Then, weeks later, a black carriage arrived, unmarked, elegant, carrying 4 men in white gloves. They worked at night, removing stones under the moonlight, stacking them into the carriage like old bricks, to be reused elsewhere. By morning, Morning Hill was dotted with holes and fresh sod. By summer, it was a garden. Lavender, peonies, tulips, and soft grass replaced marble and memory. A curved bench was added in the center, carved from elm, with the inscription, "To peace, not remembrance." The town accepted it without protest. It had become a place of quiet joy, of picnics and strolls, of proposals whispered beneath flowering dogwoods. No one asked what happened to the bodies. No one even asked if there had been any. This transformation was not spontaneous. It was orchestrated, deliberately, methodically, by the man who had come to be known as Dr. Thaddeus Verge. He arrived in Elmbrook a decade earlier, dressed more like a European statesman than a countryside physician, tall, composed, always in black. He had studied medicine in Berlin and philosophy in Vienna. But it was his time under Jean-Martin Charcot in Paris, observing hypnotic therapy on hysteria patients, that shaped the strange ideas he brought back with him. He believed grief was not a burden of the heart but a disease of memory. Left untreated, it decayed the mind, distorted the world, and ultimately invited madness. But what if, he wondered, the mind could be edited? At first, he simply offered the grieving his services. Long walks through the woods, whispered mantras in the library, rituals involving scented candles, and carefully written journal scripts. His patients called it calming, as if he reached inside their sorrow and rewrote it in softer ink. Then came the flower therapy. He urged mourners to spend time tending roses, rather than crying over tombstones. He told them that flowers reminded the spirit it had not been abandoned, that memory was a grave, but life was a garden. Within months, the mourners of Elmbrook began to act lighter, as if their sorrows were ... misplaced. But Dr. Verge did not stop at healing. He began to question why death needed to be remembered at all. He held a lecture in the town's small courthouse, titled The Tyranny of Grief. Only a few dozen came, mostly out of politeness, but his words struck deeper than anyone expected. Grief, he said, is not noble. It is parasitic. It devours the present to feed on the past. What if we starved it? What if, instead of giving it shrines and anniversaries and names etched in stone, we denied it language altogether? The room had fallen into a strange, dreamy silence. From then on, he began requesting permissions from widows and bereaved parents. He would say, "If you allow me, I can help you forget the pain entirely. No more tears. No more late-night whispers to those who cannot hear you." The strange thing was, it worked on Mrs. Elisa Fenwick, who lost her 2 sons in the influenza outbreak, was the first. After 6 weeks with Dr. Verge, she began referring to herself as a childless spinster. She laughed more. She volunteered at the schoolhouse. When shown a photograph of her boys curly-haired laughing in suspenders, she blinked, smiled politely, and said, "These are lovely children. Are they yours?" Others followed, dozens, then hundreds, each one released from the cage of grief, but also stripped of a part of themselves. The town's records began changing. The cemetery ledger vanished from City Hall. Church death notices were removed from the bulletin board. One day, the librarian found a blank spot where the mourning section had once been, pages torn, shelves rearranged. When asked, she shrugged and said, "That section never existed. I think." Even births began to vanish. Whole bloodlines dissolved in memory. People began to forget the names of their mothers, their husbands, even their own children. Yet no one panicked, no one protested. That was perhaps the most terrifying part, because whatever Dr. Verge was doing, whether it was hypnotism, chemical treatment, or something darker, it lulled the town into a dream they did not wish to wake from. There was one man who resisted. Caleb Miner, the town's gravedigger, had buried over 300 people on Morning Hill during his 30-year service. He was quiet, devout, and built like the trees he lived among. When he noticed Tombstones disappearing, he confronted the mayor, only to be met with a confused stare. "Morning Hill?" the mayor asked. "You mean the garden? Caleb, are you feeling all right?" "I dug my wife's grave there," Caleb said quietly. "Row 5, near the ash tree." The mayor smiled, sympathetic. "Perhaps you dreamed it. You have been alone too long." Caleb went home and retrieved his old records, pages yellowed and brittle, each grave mapped by hand. But when he showed them to the town clerk, the man gasped and stepped back as if Caleb had handed him a bomb. These are fakes. Fabrications. No such people are in our census." And so Caleb walked to the hill himself. He expected resistance, or at least the cold dread of trespass. But no one stopped him. The garden was empty, bathed in golden light. Flowers swayed gently. Indifferent, he fell to his knees at the edge of the old ash tree, and began digging with his bare hands. An hour passed, then 2, then 3. At a depth of 4 feet, his fingers struck something hard. Not wood, but stone. A carved piece of marble. He cleared the soil, revealing a single letter. H. He dug further. Frantic, more letters emerged. A-R-O-W. It was his wife's grave. Hannah Arrow Miner. But the stone had been buried, not removed. He stared at it for a long time, then looked up and noticed something else. Tiny white petals resting on the surface of the earth. They were falling. Not from the sky. Not from any nearby tree. From the ground itself. Caleb staggered backward. Then he heard it. Laughter, not malicious. Not mocking, childlike. It echoed faintly across the garden. He ran. The next morning he knocked on every door in Elmbrook, trying to remind people of who they had lost. He held photographs. He screamed names. He wept. But one by one, the townspeople closed their doors, some gently, some with irritation. By nightfall, he stood alone in the churchyard, staring at the old bell tower. And then, he vanished. No one saw him leave town. His house remained untouched. His notes were burned in a fire that had no known cause. By the next Sunday, the children at school were asking each other, "Who was that strange man with the shovel?" To which the teacher answered, "I do not know. Perhaps a traveler, perhaps no one." And just like that, the only man who remembered the dead became a ghost himself. By autumn, Dr. Verge opened a new wing in his practice. It was called the Restoration Room. Inside, there were no windows. Only a large velvet chair, shelves filled with blank books, and a phonograph playing wind sounds from the forest. Patients were invited to sit, to listen, and to forget. But a question began to rise, not from the living, but from those untouched corners of memory that refused to die quietly. Where did the bodies go, if the graves were not exhumed? If the coffins were not taken? If the earth remained still? Then why did some flowers grow darker than others? Why did their roots feel warm? And why, in the dead of night, did the garden hum like it remembered everything the town had tried to forget? There was a door behind the doctor's home, not the front entrance, with its whitewashed steps and carefully aligned booths for guests. Not the parlor with its cordial tea and polite conversation. This door stood at the back of the house, shadowed by creeping ivy and shielded by a trellis of overgrown grapevines. Few knew it was there. Even fewer had walked through it and come back with their memories intact. They called it the treatment room. But that word treatment betrayed what truly happened behind that door. There were no windows in that room. No clocks, no reflections. The walls were padded, not for safety, but for silence. The air smelled of earth and chalk. Time thickened inside, dragging itself across the floor like fog. Once the door shut, it never opened again in the same way. Dr. Thaddeus Verge believed grief was not meant to be endured. He claimed the human mind was a house too frail for mourning. That pain, when given permission to fester, could hollow a man into something unspeakable. So he devised a cure, not to ease sorrow, but to erase the very idea of loss. The first subject we know by name was a woman called Mercy Denton, widow of a miller. Her daughter had drowned in the river just beyond the cornfields, and her screams had been heard across Elmbrook for days. She did not sleep. She wandered barefoot, arms outstretched, calling for a child no one dared name. They say she bled from her eyes one night, not tears, blood. The townsfolk whispered she was cursed, that her sorrow had invited something unholy. That was when Dr. Verge stepped in. He found her kneeling in the mud, took her by the wrist, and led her quietly through that hidden door. Returned 3 days later, hair combed, dress clean. And when asked where her daughter had gone, she paused, and smiled. I do not believe I ever had a child. No one questioned it. Not aloud. Elmbrook was a town where gossip moved like pollen, unseen, but always blooming somewhere. And in every home, the same unease began to settle. What if forgetting was easier than remembering? Dr. Verge became a quiet prophet. Grief was the devil, he said. Memory was its language. If you forgot the dead, the devil starved soon. The treatment room had no rest. Fathers whose sons died in chimney fires. Mothers whose infants perished in fevered cradles. A boy whose older brother vanished in the snow and never returned. One by one, they entered the windowless room, and came out believing nothing had been lost. In one case, a man named Tobias Grant insisted that his wife, gone 6 years, had never existed. When shown her wedding ring, he asked why someone would show him a trinket from the market. When brought to her gravestone, he remarked on how peaceful the flower bed looked. But there was no flower bed before. There had been a grave, and now there was not. Inside the treatment room, Dr. Verge practiced what he called cognitive refraction, a ritual of suggestion, sensory deprivation, and psychological trickery that broke memory into its most fragile pieces. His process was neither scientific nor spiritual. It was surgical, but the scalpel never touched the body. It began with stillness. The subject was seated in a padded chair. The walls were completely soundproof, and the lights dimmed to a dusky blue. The doctor's voice, trained to a gentle murmur, would ask questions not meant to be answered. Instead, the questions unstitched the subject's mind. When did you first begin to mourn someone you do not remember? Can sorrow be trusted if no one else feels it with you? Would you prefer the pain, or the absence of pain? He would whisper these for hours. Then came the mirror. Not a real one, but a silver plate suspended from the ceiling, casting back only a shadowed blur. He would ask them to look into it and describe the face of the one they had lost. With each attempt, he would correct them. That is not her nose. Your son had green eyes, not brown. Are you sure that was his name? Until doubt took root, until truth unraveled, until the face in the mirror looked nothing like the one they remembered. Then came the final stage, sensory overwrite. This was the most dangerous part. The subject would be exposed to intense flashes of light, a series of spoken affirmations, lies, dressed as reassurances, and scents that had nothing to do with their original trauma. Lavender, instead of blood. Lemon balm, instead of smoke. Pine resin, instead of river water. The body would begin to reject the original memory. Dr. Verge recorded his success rate at 73%. But those numbers mean little when the result is a human soul, hollowed out and rewritten. Word spread, but it was not criticism that followed. It was gratitude. Widowers came back to their homes, whistling. Bereaved parents now tended gardens instead of graves. Schoolteachers no longer read poems about death. Even the church sermons changed. Heaven was no longer a place one looked forward to. It was an idea the town outgrew, and at the center of it all stood the doctor, smiling, reserved, always calm. He insisted he had not stolen memories. He had only freed people from them. And yet, strange things began to happen. One evening, the baker asked where his mother had gone. He had just spoken to her the day before, or so he thought. A child screamed in the night, claiming her house was full of people with no faces. A man tried to bury his shadow, because he said it belonged to someone who died. These were not isolated events. They were symptoms. Dr. Verge was called in each time, and each time, he made it right. With one more treatment, one more adjustment, one more trip into that room, with no windows. But the townsfolk did not notice what they were losing, because forgetting feels quiet. It is not a scream. It is a silence that becomes normal, and then it becomes law. Eventually, grieving itself was seen as a weakness. Children were taught not to cry. The cemetery was renamed Thistle Meadow Park. Tombstones were ground into gravel. Portraits of lost family members were burned and replaced with landscapes. Grief was outlawed not by force, but by fashion. And Dr. Ver, he simply kept opening that back door. Some say he believed he was doing God's work. Others claimed he was searching for something. A pain he could not erase in himself. A face he could not forget, no matter how many times he tried. But no one ever asked him directly, because to ask about death in Elmbrook was to invite it back, and no one wanted that. They called it Thistle Meadow Park, a wide open garden at the eastern edge of Elmbrook, tended daily, kept in perfect rows, with no plaques, no fences, no names, just flowers, foxglove, columbine, bluebells, nightshade. A little girl once asked why the garden always looked sad, even in full bloom. Her mother told her flowers could not be sad. They had no memories. But the girl disagreed, because sometimes, when the wind blew through that meadow, just before dusk, it did not sound like wind. It sounded like whispers. And sometimes, not often, but enough to notice the earth in Thistle Meadow cracked open after the rain. Always in the same spot. Always in the shape of a rectangle. In the beginning, no one questioned it. The garden was too beautiful, too peaceful. Families came to picnic. Artists came to paint. Dr. Verge himself called it the final stage of healing, a symbol of how far Elmbrook had come. Where once there had been grief, now there was growth. But nature, like memory, does not always obey silence. Beneath the roots of every tulip, beneath the petals of every peony, lay something the town had chosen not to remember, something that was not finished forgetting them. The first real sign came from a man named Amos Tiller. Amos was not from Elm. He was a grave marker salesman from Concord, traveling by horse and cart. When he passed through the town, he stopped to water his horse near the garden. That was when he noticed the ground. Too soft, he later told a friend. Too soft for real. Grass like something's buried shallow. He began to poke around, measured distances, counted rows. His instincts, born from years of cemetery work, told him this was not a meadow. This was a map. A graveyard turned inside out. When Amos asked about it in town, no one answered. Not with words, but they stared, as if he had spoken of profanity. As if even the syllable of grave had weight. That night, he was asked politely to leave town. He did not argue. He did not sleep. He simply rode away and never returned. But his journal did. Weeks later, a young teacher named Eliza Carr found it in the lost and found at the schoolhouse. Leather-bound, water-damaged, pages marked with sketches of the garden, but overlaid with grids and annotations. Former gravesite headstone removed. Unmarked pit. She was unsettled, but curious, so she asked her pupils to write essays on their family trees. Most returned blank papers. A few had vague notes, but none of the children could name anyone in their family who had died. Not grandparents, not cousins, not even siblings. Eliza took her questions to the town records office. There, she found something far stranger than silence. She found edits. Entire pages had been replaced, sections redacted. Some documents rewritten in different ink, others filed under unrelated names. The town's registrar, a quiet man with sunken cheeks, said only this: "We do not keep what does not help us grow." She did not know what that meant, but she knew she would not sleep that night. The next day, Eliza walked the garden. She brought nothing with her but a scarf and Amos Tiller's journal. She began to dig. Not with a shovel, she knew that would draw attention, but with her hands, just beneath a row of lilies that had no scent. 6 inches deep. Her fingers scraped stone. She brushed away the dirt. Letters. Faint. Weather-worn. Barely visible. But they were there. A name. Emthin. The soil began to bleed. It was not blood. Not really. But something thick and dark. A sap-like ooze, rising from beneath the grave, or the flower bed. Depending on who you asked. She backed away. But the ground did not stop. It pulsed, as if something underneath had heard her. Had felt her. And now it remembered. That same night, the wind changed. The town heard it. Every home. Every barn. Every sleeping child. It was not the wind, it was chanting. Faint. Crooked. Distant. But real words not in English. Or any language Elmbrook knew. It came from the garden. And when morning came, half the flowers were dead. Their roots blackened. Their petals curled inward. And in the dirt beneath them, little bones. Not whole skeletons. Not recognizable forms. But bits. Pieces. Enough to know. Something had been growing with the flowers. Or through them. Dr. Verge did not speak for 3 days. He was seen walking the garden, alone at night, in full suit, hands clasped behind his back, muttering. Some said he was praying. Others believed he was listening. Either way, he returned to his clinic and locked every drawer. He burned papers in the fireplace for hours, but the garden kept bleeding. It was not long before the townsfolk began to slip. Small things. At first, a man who could not recall if his wife had ever borne a child, a woman who forgot her own sister's voice mid-conversation, a boy who saw his father crying in the basement, not with grief, but confusion, holding a baby's rattle and asking whose it was. Then it escalated. People forgot their own names. Marriages dissolved overnight, not in argument, but in absence. One woman, Margaret Lane, locked herself in her attic and wrote every name she could remember on the walls. By the next morning, she had painted over them all in black. When asked why, she answered, "They were not mine." The doctor issued a public statement. He called it residual cognitive, a temporary regression, nothing dangerous. The mind, he said, sometimes kicks against peace, clawing for old wounds. The treatment was still working. Elmbrook was still healing. But by now, even his calm voice sounded off. To rehearsed, to still, like a mask painted onto silence. And behind his eyes, something darker began to stir. Not guilt, not fear, but disappointment. As if the town had failed him. Then the flowers began to speak. No mouths. No movement, but messages. Scratched, into bark, etched into the soil, carved into the undersides of petals. Names, dates, questions. Where is my child? Why did you forget me? Who buried the truth in bloom? The whispers returned, now louder, and with them, the smell of rot. No one went near the garden anymore, not even Dr. Verge. One final incident broke the spell. Eliza Carr, the teacher, vanished, left her house one morning, told a neighbor she was going to speak with the doctor. She never arrived, never returned. Her scarf was found later, twisted in the roots of a half-dead rose bush. Beside it, a single line etched into the dirt. He cannot forget what he never buried. The townspeople gathered, not in anger, but in clarity. They remembered. Not all of it, not names, not faces, but they remembered something had been stolen from them, and worse, they had thanked the thief. Some wanted to burn the garden. Others wanted to confront the doctor. But no one could decide what truth they were actually seeking. Because they had lived without grief so long, they no longer knew what it was supposed to feel like. And still, the flowers grew, vivid, unnatural, blooming in the shapes of hands. In the final days of summer, Elmbrook changed. Not in noise, not in fire, but in silence. The kind of silence that moves like water, slow, thick, and cold. The kind that carries things with it. Names, memories, and finally, people. By now, only 67 residents remained. Those who had forgotten how to leave, or remembered too much to run. The meadow stood untouched, still blooming, still watching. No one dared speak of what they saw in the petals anymore. The patterns of human teeth in the roses. The veins in the bluebells that pulsed when touched. The garden had grown a memory, and it would not let go. One morning, as the sun fractured through the mist, they heard the bell. 3 slow chimes. The same rhythm used for morning in the old church, but the bell had not rung in years. No one had touched the rope, and yet it echoed, as if the church itself had remembered something or someone. By noon, the people gathered, not by plan, not by invitation, but by instinct, a slow trickle of bodies, moving toward the clinic, toward the man who had given them peace, and taken something far greater in return. They stood in front of his door, like shadows that had grown too tall. Inside, he waited. Not surprised. Not afraid. Just calm. The way only a man who truly believes in his own righteousness can be. Dr. Verge opened the door himself, wore his coat, pressed shirt, pocket watch in place, and a look that neither welcomed nor resisted. Just expected. He stepped out and faced them like a teacher, about to give a lecture, and then he spoke. Dr. Verge, you came back too soon. I warned you it would hurt. That healing is not about remembering. It is about removal. You were drowning, and I dried the sea. Why are you crying now? A woman stepped forward. Her hands were shaking. She held a tiny wooden shoe, child-sized, half-rotten, found in her attic 2 nights ago. She asked only one question. What was her name? Verge looked at the shoe, then at her, then answered slowly. She never had one. That was the crack, not in his voice, but in the town, because now they knew, not just what was taken, but how they remembered the sessions, the injections, the soft, green room with the ticking clock. They remembered the clinic being full, not with patients, but with records. Boxes and boxes of them. All gone now. Burned in the fireplace. Removed. Another man stepped forward, and another, holding small tokens, fragments, photos with faces scratched out, toys with no owners, birth certificates with missing dates. Each one asked the same thing, and each time Verge replied the same way. They never had a name. They never existed. They never mattered. Until finally, a girl no older than 10 walked up. No parents left. She held nothing in her hand, only a question in her mouth. Did you forget my brother too? Verge did not answer. He turned away and locked the clinic door. That night, the town lit lanterns. Not candles, not torches, lanterns. And they walked past the church, past the schoolhouse, toward the garden. Some believed they were going to dig. Others believed they were going to destroy it. But what they did, no one expected. They walked into it one by one, hands outstretched, not to pluck the flowers, but to lie among them. Some laid down in rows, some kneeled, eyes closed, whispering names they had not spoken in decades. Some pressed their palms into the dirt, as if trying to reach through it, into the memory below. The ground pulsed like breath, like heartbeat, and for the first time, the garden answered. The earth split. Not in violence, but in surrender. Cracks formed in the shape of graves, rose columns beneath each flower, a hollow dot inside each hollow, a piece, bone, ribbon, tooth, name tag, baby doll, a fragmented mosaic of Elmbrook's erased children, spouses, parents, lovers, stitched back together by soil and sorrow. The flowers wilted, and where they fell, names bloomed. Etched into the dirt, in bright living red. Written not in blood but memory. The next morning, Dr. Verge was found at the center of the meadow. His coat was folded neatly beside him. His body lay beneath a cluster of nightshade. He was not buried. He was rooted, his hands stretched into the ground, fingers tangled into black vines, face turned toward the sky, mouth filled with soil. His eyes were open, and from them, tears of pollen. The garden remains now fenced, now marked. The town has since built a wall around it, but no one calls it a meadow anymore. Its new name is carved on a stone by the gate. The field of Rembrng. No flowers grow there now, only moss, and sometimes, if you press your ear to the ground, you can hear children laughing, or crying, or calling for someone to remember them again. Elmbrook never appeared on national maps. No headlines, no press, no documentaries. But its story lives in the margins of psychology textbooks, in footnotes, in whispers. The Verge method is no longer practiced. Its original notes were destroyed. But some say the concept was not erased, only rebranded. Therapies that promise peace by subtraction. Drugs that quiet pain by severing memory. Clinics that call it evolution, not amnesia. But the truth is older than science. Older than Elmbrook. It is this. You can bury grief. You can drown memory. You can burn the records and silence the names. But the dead do not forget, and neither do the flowers.